Alright, welcome back to Whence Came You, a Freemasonic podcast featuring research papers and discussions related to Freemasonry. I'm your host, Brother Robert Johnson. This is episode 147. Some news for this week: if you are listening to this on June 8th or 9th, you should know that on Wednesday, June 11th at 7:30 p.m., I am going to be at Kingsbury Lodge, number 466, F&AM of Pennsylvania, and I'll be presenting Freemasonry in America and its Colonial Tavern Beginnings, which is a keynote presentation that I do, and if you want to know where it is, it's Kingsbury Masonic Lodge, again, number 466. The address is 410 Delaware Avenue, Olyphant, PA, and again, it's at 7:30 p.m., So I look forward to seeing you there. I know the Worshipful Master there and a few of the other officers, and even Brother Robert Walk is coming out, I believe. So looking forward to some good fellowship and some good education. I'll see you guys all there. In addition to that, the week of the 23rd of June, I will be in the Washington, D.C. area. Now, this isn't going to be for the show. It is actually because I do have a day job, and I have to go there for my day job. That being said, my nights are pretty much free, and I'm going to be hitting up a few of the lodges out there, and I'm really looking forward to going out and visiting with Brother John Ruark and Brother Jason Richards. If you don't know who they are basically the two more original members, or the guys who kind of started the Masonic Roundtable, which is a show on Google Hangouts / YouTube. Very much looking forward to that trip as well. I will keep you posted as to what we will be doing and going in case maybe there's some Masonic events we might be able to go to during that week, and we'd be able to meet some of you and share some real fellowship and have some fun. And then later on in 2015, I will be presenting also the Freemasonry in America and Colonial Tavern Beginnings at Brother Gorley's Lodge. And if you don't know Brother Gorley, he is the author of Freemasonry Defined, using history to understand the fraternity. He is, I believe, going to be the Worshipful Master at the time and has invited me out. So I graciously accepted, and I'm really looking forward to, again, hanging out and having some great fellowship. So initially I was going to have 2 papers for this week, as I usually like to do. However, this week is a little different. I have a piece that is pretty long, and I thought about separating it up into a couple weeks, but I just don't think it'll be as good that way. So I will present it tonight in its entirety. So here we go. So this paper is called A Comparison of the Biblical and Masonic Accounts of the Building of King Solomon's Temple. It's by Brother Terrence Satchel, Mount Rushmore Lodge number 220, Grand Lodge of South Dakota. And it's pulled from the website www.freemasons-freemasonry.com. A little introduction on the website says, this paper offers a comparison between the accounts of the building of King Solomon's Temple in Masonic ritual and the accounts given in the Old Testament of the Bible. Its intent is to condense the information regarding the adaptation of the story of King Solomon's Temple in Masonic ritual into one paper so that Masonic brethren can study and compare the two accounts more easily. It concludes that while many similarities between the biblical and Masonic account of this event exist, there are also some discrepancies. Introduction. Once upon a time, when I was receiving the 3 degrees of Masonry, an old friend informed me that everything in the Masonic ritual could be found in the Bible. He was right. Much of what is found in the ritual may be discovered in the Old Testament. However, the scriptures present 2 different accounts of that primary Masonic allegory, the building of King Solomon's Temple. The 2 accounts of this temple's construction can be found in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. The historical accounts presented in both books are very similar. However, there are some discrepancies in some of the details of the story. For instance, it is common to find differences in the quantities presented in the 2 different accounts. The discovery of Masonic ritual in scriptural readings has always been particularly fascinating to me. It is exciting to know a secret meaning regarding scripture, particularly when surrounded by those unaware of its relevance to the private order of Freemasonry. However, It is surprising that many Masons never take the time to examine the information presented in the Masonic rituals in its original context. It can be an enlightening experience to discover both the accuracy of the Bible accounts in Masonic ritual as well as discover the discrepancies between the biblical and the Masonic accounts of these events. Both the Hebrew history found in the Old Testament and the Masonic ritual are subject to the errors of oral communication. The Old Testament was written down only after many years of oral communication, which eroded the details of the original eyewitness accounts. Likewise, Masonic ritual has been subject to errors of the same nature over time, and the fact that the ritual has been continually revised and abridged for several centuries due to the presentation of the ritual by memory, the Masonic initiate may receive inaccurate information that he may never discover to be an error unless he conducts his own research on the subject. This paper offers no new information or exciting conclusions. It is simply condensing information that is in many places into one to allow the Mason easy access to discover the story of King Solomon's temple as told in the Bible. It will prove most enlightening if the reader keeps a translation of the Old Testament at hand so that biblical references may be quickly accessed. The Bibles used in compiling this paper are the New International Version Study Bible edited by Kenneth Baker, published by Zondervan Publishing House in 1995, and the Holy Bible King James Version published by Heirloom Bible Publishers, 1988. The Masonic ritual used as a reference in the ritual authorized for use by the Grand Lodge of South Dakota. Entered Apprentice Degree, Historical Lecture. The historical lecture found in the Entered Apprentice degree seeks to use the historical accounts found in the Hebrew traditions to rationalize the events which occur in the first degree. The first reference to King Solomon's temple is in the lecture regards the fact that the stones taken from the quarry were properly hewn and squared at the quarry, and not at the construction site at the temple. Quote, "There was not heard the sound of an axe, hammer, or any tools of iron. The stones were all hewn, squared, and numbered at the quarries, where they were raised." End quote. Indeed, this can be found in 1 Kings' account of the construction of King Solomon's temple. 1 Kings 6:7 reads, "In building the temple, only blocks dressed at the quarry were used, and no hammer, chisel, or any other iron tool was heard at the temple site while it was being built." End quote. Therefore, this fact is taken directly from the Old Testament. The following excerpt from the first lecture of the Entered Apprentice degree explains the method by which the lumber for the temple was transported to Jerusalem. The timbers felled and prepared in the forests of Lebanon, conveyed by sea in floats to Joppa, thence by land to Jerusalem, where they were set up with wooden malls prepared for that purpose. And while the building was completed, its several parts fitted with such exact nicety that it had more the appearance of the handiwork of the supreme architect of the universe than of human hands. End quote. This part of the historical account may be found in King Hiram's response to King Solomon in 1 Kings 9:9. The final sentence of this excerpt from the ritual appears to be an addition designed to glorify the workmanship of the craftsmen which labored on the temple. Perhaps it is meant to stress the importance of the symbolic lessons which can be learned from the building of King Solomon's temple. The historical lecture of this degree refers to the mason's apron with the following statement: "You are presented with a lambskin or white leather apron because lamb has in all ages been deemed an emblem of innocence," etc., etc. This makes no mention of any biblical reference, which indicates that the wear of the apron by speculative Masons, as well as the manner in which the apron in form, is in fact a Masonic invention. The ritual of the first section of the degree supports this by saying, quote, "Masonic tradition informs us that at the building of King Solomon's temple," etc., etc. Indeed, an examination of the accounts of the construction of King Solomon's temple shows that the apron of the craftsman is never mentioned. The lecture also contains two other statements that appear to have no biblical basis. First, the lecture states that guards were placed at the east, south, and west gates of King Solomon's temple. No mention of these gates is made in the accounts of King Solomon's temple provided in Scripture. The lecture also mentions that the first stone of the foundation of the building is placed in the northeast corner. Again, no biblical account of the building of the temple mentions the placement of a first stone, and therefore the statement is derived solely from the traditions of operative Masons. Entered Apprentice Degree Illustrated Lecture. The second lecture in the first degree is said to relate more particularly to the lodge. It is no surprise, then, that its contents relies heavily on the biblical account of King Solomon's temple in order to rationalize the forms, supports, coverings, furniture, ornaments, lights, and jewels found in the lodge. It is said that, quote, the form of a lodge is an oblong square, extending from east to west and between the north and the south, from the center to the surface and from the earth to the highest heaven. The information regarding the shape and orientation of the lodge does indeed originate from biblical accounts of King Solomon's temple. The measurements of the temple in the Old Testament say that it was 60 cubits long, 20 wide, and 30 high. 1 Kings 6:2. Chronicles gives the same dimensions for the length and width of the building, therefore the shape would be an oblong square or rectangle. The orientation of the building requires a study of the pillars at the entrance of the temple. While these pillars will be discussed in more detail in the section pertaining to the fellowcraft degree, it is necessary to have a brief discussion of their position here to prove the lodge orientation. The New International Version of the Bible states that, quote, he erected the pillars at the portico of the temple. The pillar to the south he named Jachin, and the one to the north Boaz. 1 Kings 7:21. However, this does not clearly define which way the temple was oriented. Luckily, the King James Version provides some light to this confusion. The same verse in the King James Version reads, quote, and he set up the pillars in the porch of the temple, and he set up the right pillar, and called the name thereof Jachin. And he set up the left pillar, and called the name thereof Boaz. End quote. So the north pillar was also the left-hand pillar, which means that the temple did face east. The ritual states that the temple faces east because it was modeled based on the tabernacle. While this is a likely assumption, the idea that the temple was built based on the tabernacle is not expressly written in the Old Testament. The illustrated lecture specifies the ornaments of a lodge as the mosaic pavement, the indented tessel, and blazing star. The blazing star is stated in the ritual as being a Masonic symbol. However, the ritual says that the mosaic pavement is a representation of the ground floor of King Solomon's temple, etc., etc. In 1 Kings 6:15, the New International Version of the Bible specifies the flooring for the ground floor of the temple as pine, and the King James Version specifies fir as the flooring of choice. However, in the opening of Lodge of Entered Apprentices, the senior warden says that he was made an entered apprentice, quote, in a regularly constituted lodge of entered apprentices, etc., etc. So the comparison of the flooring of the lodge to the flooring of King Solomon's temple is probably a statement which means that a lodge of entered apprentices represents the ground floor of King Solomon's temple, and the word mosaic has nothing to do with the actual flooring of the temple. The indented tessel is an adaptation of the description of the temple given in the Old Testament. 1 Kings 6:15 says, quote, he lined its interior walls with cedar boards, paneling them from the floor of the temple to the ceiling. End quote. Verse 18 of the 6th chapter of 1 Kings says that, quote, the inside of the tabernacle was cedar carved with gourds and open flowers. End quote. This would indicate that the walls were decorated. So the statement, quote, the indented tessel of the beautiful tessellated borders or skirting which surrounded it, end quote, is referring to the decorated walls found in the temple. The final specific reference to the actual construction of King Solomon's temple in the first degree refers to the lights of the lodge. Masonic ritual states that, quote, a lodge has 3 lights, situated east, west, and south. None in the north, because of the situation of King Solomon's temple, having been situated so far north of the ecliptic that the sun or moon at meridian height could dart any ray of light into the northern part thereof. End quote. The temple did have windows as specified in 1 Kings 6:4. However, this excerpt from the ritual deals with the geographic location of King Solomon's temple. The temple was built at Jerusalem. Geographically, Jerusalem is positioned north of the equator, as well as north of the Tropic of Cancer. Therefore, the sun or moon would never be positioned north of the temple, and no light would ever enter directly through the windows on the north side of the temple, even at meridian height. The Fellowcraft Degree. Middle Chamber Lecture. The Middle Chamber Lecture is littered with references to King Solomon's temple. The first reference to the construction of King Solomon's temple details the working habits of the craftsmen who built the temple. The ritual says, quote, they worked 6 days before receiving their wages, etc., etc. This is doubtlessly a reference to the 4th commandment, which reads, quote, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. Exodus 20:8. End quote. As this commandment was Jewish law at the time of the building of King Solomon's temple, it is certain that the craftsman conformed to this regulation. The next section of the Middle Chamber lecture gives a detailed description of the pillars at the entrance of King Solomon's temple. The first thing that attracts your attention as we advance is a representation of 2 brazen pillars, etc., etc. The King James Version of the Old Testament affirms the name and position of the pillars in 1 Kings 7:21. The word Jachin is defined as he establishes, and the word Boaz is defined as in him is strength in the notes found in the New International Version of the Bible. This is said to allude to a promise made by God to David. This can be found in the 7th chapter of 2 Samuel, while the specific phrase, quote, in strength would he establish his kingdom, end quote, does not appear. The chapter features the promise which the Lord made to David. The Lord reminds David of his strength that he has provided by cutting off David's enemies and making him king. Therefore the Lord would indeed establish a kingdom for David, and David would build him a quote, unquote, house of cedar. This is obviously a reference to King Solomon's temple and serves well to tie the meaning of the pillars into the story. However, nothing is mentioned in the books of 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles of the pillars' allusion to the promise. It is therefore a Masonic conjecture. The Old Testament confirms the location and manner of the pillars' construction. 1 King 7:46 reads, quote, the king had them cast in the clay molds in the plain of the Jordan between Succoth and Zarethan, end quote. In the King James Version, 2 Chronicles 4:17 describes the location as being between Succoth and Zeradatha. Therefore, the various spellings of this place can be attributed to different translations. The pillars were cast in this location along with a number of other items that were created to adorn the temple. The builder of the pillars was a man named Hiram. 1 Kings 7:13-14 says, quote, King Solomon sent to Tyre and brought Huram, whose mother was a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and whose father was a man of Tyre, and a craftsman in bronze, end quote. The 2 Chronicles account of the bronze worker describes him as Huram Abi, and of his lineage it says, quote, whose mother was from Dan, and whose father was from Tyre. 2 Chronicles 2:14, end quote. It is interesting to note that the Danites were located near the Sidonians, a Phoenician people. Judges 18:7. This would make the widow's relationship to a man of Tyre very reasonable. However, she could have been a member of the tribe of Naphtali living in Dan. It is an interesting conflict between the two accounts, with no absolute explanation to be found in Scripture. The account of the man named Hiram in 2 Chronicles expands the breadth of his expertise. King Hiram says of the craftsman, quote, he is trained to work in gold and silver, bronze and iron, stone and wood, and with purple and blue and crimson yarn and fine linen. He is experienced in all kinds of engraving and can execute any design given to him. He will work with your craftsmen and with those of my lord David your father, end quote. Therefore Hiram was a jack of all trades. He was the artificer designated to craft all of the decorative adornments for the temple. The pillars are described in detail in Masonic ritual. The following excerpt is the Masonic account of the appearance of the pillars. As a general precaution, I did remove this section. It will be available on the app if you so choose to download it. No mention is made in the Bible of the pillars being cast hollow. This would make sense because the large pillars would be far more expensive and would be of an incredible weight if they were not cast hollow. However, the phrase, quote, the better to serve as a safe repository for the archives of Masonry, end quote, indicates that this is a Masonic assumption on the construction and the purpose for the pillars. There is certainly no mention made of any archives deposited into the pillars. The Old Testament features conflicting accounts of the height of the pillars. The King James Version of 2 Chronicles 3:15 says, quote, also he made before the house 2 pillars of 30 and 5 cubits high, and the chapiter that was on top of each of them was 5 cubits, end quote. However, in 1 Kings, the pillars are said to be, quote, each 18 cubits high and 12 cubits around by line. He also made 2 capitals of cast bronze to set on the tops of the pillars. Each capital was 5 cubits high. 1 Kings 7:15-16, end quote. No conflict ever arises around the measurement of the diameter of the pillars. It is interesting to note that the New International Version states that the pillars, quote, together were 35 cubits, end quote. The notes of that text point out that the word together was added to reconcile the difference in the measurements of the two versions. This is doubtlessly only speculation on the true value of the measurements, as two different quantities are provided in Scripture. Yet another different account of the dimensions of the pillars exists. In 2 Kings 25:17, the height of the capitals are given as 3 cubits in the King James Version. Stranger still, the New International Version lists the measurements given in 2 Kings in feet, although the measurements given in this version are the correct size. The New International Version of the Bible does not give a conclusive answer to who authored these books. However, this version does say the book of 1 Kings and 2 Kings are actually part of the same work, which indicates that they had the same author. While the tradition of communicating history orally was common at the time, it is certainly odd that one author would provide two different measurements of these pillars. The true dimensions, therefore, are unknown. The chapiters were adorned with lilywork, network, and pomegranates. 1 Kings 7:17 through 19 mentions these 3 types of adornments found in the chapiters. However, 2 Chronicles 3:16 makes no mention of lilies on the chapiters. This discrepancy may be attributed to the fact that the 2 books were created from 2 different oral accounts of the temple. The meanings attributed to these adornments are Masonic in origin. Scripture describes the shape of the chapiters as bowl-shaped. 1 Kings 7:41. This indicates that the pillars perhaps supported a roof and did not terminate in the spherical globes mentioned in the Masonic ritual. The ritual says that these globes are 2 artificial spherical bodies on the convex surfaces of which are represented the countries, seas, and various parts of the earth, the face of the heavens, the planetary revolutions, and other important particulars. End quote. There is absolutely no evidence in the Old Testament that there were representations of the globe or its celestial bodies on the pillars built by the widow's son. After learning about the pillars at the entrance of the temple, the lecture proceeds to discuss the winding staircase consisting of 3, 5, and 7 steps. If one reads the account of the temple in the New International Version, he may well be confused as to where the Bible speaks of the winding stairs. This version mentions only a stairway which led from the ground floor to the middle level. However, in the King James Version, the winding stairs can be found. 1 Kings 6:8 says, quote, "The door of the middle chamber was in the right side of the house, and they went up the winding stairs into the middle chamber, and out of the middle chamber into the third." End quote. No mention is made anywhere in the Bible of the stairway consisting of 3, 5, and 7 steps. This is a Masonic addition, and a number of articles have been written on that meaning of these numbers. This paper will not attempt to address the symbolism of the number of the steps because that explanation requires a volume on its own. At this point, it is necessary to explain the arrangement of the floors of King Solomon's temple. The New International Version of the Bible provides an explanation of the arrangement of the temple which can be difficult to compare with Masonic teachings. The King James Version provides an easier text for which the arrangement of the temple is in Masonic ritual may be studied. Chapter 6 of 1 Kings explains the arrangement thus, quote, "And against the wall of the house he built chambers round, and against the walls of the house round about, both of the temple and of the oracle. And he made chambers round about. The nethermost chamber was 5 cubits broad, and the middle was 6 cubits broad, and the third was 7 cubits broad. For without in the wall of the house he made narrowed rests round about, that the beams should not be fastened in the walls of the house. The door for the middle chamber was in the right side of the house, and they went up with winding stairs into the middle chamber, and out of the middle chamber into the third." 1 Kings 6, 5 through 8. End quote. The house is the inner sanctuary of King Solomon's temple, or the Sanctum Sanctorum. The ground floor and middle chamber, which are referred to in the Masonic degrees, were actually side chambers built around the Sanctum Sanctorum. There were 3 levels of outer chambers. The ground floor of the middle chamber are mentioned in Masonic ritual, and the third floor is neglected. The next part of the lecture is a journey through the inner and outer doors of the middle chamber. From the earlier discussions on the orientation of the temple, it is understood that the direction referred to as quote-unquote right in the King James Version is the southern direction. Therefore, the entrance to the outer door was situated in the south and corresponds with the junior warden's station as the representation of the outer door as his station resides in the south. Judging from Scripture, it would appear that the discussion of the outer door should come before the section on the winding staircase. No discussion of an inner door takes place in the Scripture, and therefore it is Masonic tradition that it exists at the west side of the chamber. When in the chamber, the recipient of the lecture receives the wage of a fellowcraft. This comes from the agreement made between King Solomon of Israel and King Hiram of Tyre. King Hiram says to Solomon, quote, "Now let my lord send his servants for wheat and barley, and the olive oil and wine that he promised." 2 Chronicles 2:15. End quote. While no mention of corn is made, it can be assumed that this was simply a substitution for wheat and barley, as it is another staple grain. Therefore, the Masonic definition of the fellowcraft's wages are indeed the same wages that the Old Testament confirms were given to the craftsmen at the temple. The last mention of King Solomon's temple in this lecture occurs during the discussion on the letter G. This lecture mentions that King Solomon's temple, quote, escaped not the unsparing ravages of barbarous force, end quote. It is true that the temple was destroyed. 2 Chronicles 36:18-19 says, quote, "He," meaning Nebuchadnezzar, "carried to Babylon all of the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, and the treasures of the Lord's temple, and the treasures of the king and his officials. They set fire to God's temple and broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all the places and destroyed everything of value there." End quote. Master Mason Degree, the Hiramic Lesson. This paper will not cover the Hiramic legend of this degree because it is just that, a legend. The historic lecture also summarizes this story. The proof that it is only a legend can be found in the biblical account of the construction of King Solomon's temple. The historic lecture begins by stating that Hiram the craftsman was taken from us prior to the completion of the temple. However, this is not in agreement with the Old Testament. Both 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles state that Hiram completed the work that he had undertaken for King Solomon in 1 Kings 7:40 and 2 Chronicles 4:11. The details pertaining to his assassination are entirely Masonic in origin. Master Mason Degree, the Illustrated Lecture. The introduction of this lecture deals specifically with the building of King Solomon's temple. The ritual says that, quote, "This magnificent structure was supported by 1,453 columns and 2,906 pilasters, all hewn from the finest Parian marble." End quote. Scripture is silent on the number of columns and pilasters, and the belief that Parian marble was used is certainly perplexing. Parian marble comes from Paros and would require a long voyage across the sea to be delivered to Jerusalem. First, the Old Testament speaks only on the transportation of the lumber from Lebanon. Such a great undertaking as importing marble from Paros would be a point of pride, and it is odd that such a detail is not included in the Hebrew traditions. Therefore, this belief is a Masonic development. The lecture gives the following numbers for the workers at the temple. There were employed in this building 3 grand masters, 3,300 masters or overseers of the work, 80,000 fellowcrafts, and 70,000 entered apprentices or bearers of burden. End quote. While the 3 grand masters are not specifically referred to with that title in the Bible, King Solomon of Israel, King Hiram of Tyre, and Hiram Abiff are the 3 main characters in the construction of King Solomon's temple. It is interesting to note that King Solomon was a Jew, King Hiram a Phoenician, and Hiram Abiff a man of mixed birth, as discussed earlier in the paper. This lays the foundation for the idea that Masons need only to believe in a supreme being and not in a specific doctrine, because at least one man, and probably 2 depending on which of the parents' religions Hiram Abiff accepted, who was intimately involved in the building of King Solomon's temple, was not a Jew. It would be absurd for Masons to limit their membership to one religious discipline when the allegory which they base their order on contains men of different religions. Also, 3 different nationalities of men were employed as craftsmen during the project. 1 King 5:18 says, quote, "The craftsmen of Solomon and Hiram and the men of Gebal cut and prepared the timber and stone for the building of the temple." End quote. So the construction of the temple was certainly a multicultural affair. This certainly provides an excellent allegory on which the Universal Brotherhood of Masonry can base its teachings. The book of 1 Kings confirms the number of Master Masons, fellowcrafts, entered apprentices employed during the building of the temple. 1 Kings 5:15-16 reads, quote, "Solomon had 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stone cutters in the hills, as well as 3,300 foremen who supervised the project and directed the work." End quote. 2 Chronicles gives 3,600 as the number of Master Masons employed. This is doubtlessly an error from the passing the tale through oral communication. In conclusion, the The Masonic account of the construction of King Solomon's Temple presents an interesting weave of biblical information and Masonic tradition. If a Mason took the ritual at its word and assumed that it borrowed only from the Old Testament and never invented any part of the story to enhance its symbolic meaning, he would be quite mistaken. While the ritual borrows liberally from the scriptural accounts of the project, it definitely invents a number of facts relating to the building of the temple. However, despite the discrepancies between the Masonic ritual and the Bible, perhaps the most intriguing information presented by the biblical account of King Solomon's Temple is the universal nature of the group of the craftsmen who constructed the building. More than 150,000 men are said to have labored on the temple. These men were of different races and creeds and constituted the craft which symbolizes our modern Masonic assemblies. They were united to build a temple to deity, one that would become the envy of the architects. It appears that perhaps the modern craft and the ancient assembly weren't so different after all. All right, I hope you enjoyed that. At this time, I'd like to remind everybody the ways to support this show. You can obviously support us through PayPal by visiting www.wcypodcast.com and click the links for support the show. You're going to see several options there. Again, first and foremost, we have the apps and PayPal. Those are the two most common ways that people choose to support the show. So if you get the apps, which are available for Android, Windows, and Apple devices, the bonus feature to getting the apps is that any papers that we read on the show that we can upload to the app via PDF, we do that so that you'll have a copy of it at your fingertips wherever you are. You could read along, you can share it in your lodge, whatever you want to do with it. The second bonus feature within the apps is the Masonically themed wallpapers that we try to put out every single week. So like right now, if you were to buy the app, there are 147 episodes, and that is 147 different Masonic wallpapers that have made and uploaded into the programming. So you can check those out whenever you want. Of course, we do have PayPal as the other means to donate to the show. You pick the amount, and whether it's $1 or $10, every little amount helps the show. All we do with it is we use it to pay for the hosting costs of the audio files and equipment. If we need a new mic or something like that, we can buy a new mic. We have two affiliates, the first being Onnit Labs. If you don't know who Onnit is, they basically make the best healthy living supplements. They're very generous with their commission sales. So basically, you click through our links to Onnit on our site, and that tells them that you came to them through us, and they give a little bit back to the show. Again, you don't pay a penny more for those products than you would if you just went directly there. They just give us a little piece of it for helping. Their products are very good. I use many of them, and I will stand by them and the quality that they do. It's great stuff. Their supplements are great. Their workout stuff is good. You can't beat it. So at the end of that, if you want to get yourself some Onnit, you click through our links to Onnit from our website, www.wcypodcast.com. Get yourself some Alpha Brain or some kettlebells, whatever you want to get. And at the end of it, you can put in the coupon code WCY, and they'll give you 10% off. Pretty good deal. The other thing is we also have an affiliate membership with FreemasonryArt.com. Now, FreemasonryArt.com is run by Brother Juan Sepulveda of the Masonic podcast, The Winding Stairs, and he's also a co-host with me, a panelist on the Masonic Roundtable, which is another show. Brother Juan is very generous also, and so if you go to www.freemasonryart.com, anything you buy, you don't have to click through our links or anything. You can go just to the site, and anything that you buy, if you put in the discount code WCY, you get 10% off, and Brother Juan sends a little bit back to the show here at Whence Came You. We also accept Bitcoin donations. It's getting a little bit more popular, so we figured we'd add it out there as an option. So those are the ways you can support the show. If you can, great. If you have in the past, I thank you so much, especially our recurring donators. You guys make this show possible, and I just have to send out a big thanks to you guys for that. So that being the only paper we're reading, I will go into this week's Famous Freemason. This week's famous Freemason is Glenn Ford. What's really kind of cool about this was that he was initiated at Palisades Lodge number 637, which is now Santa Monica Palisades Lodge number 307. The very same lodge my good friend and brother Robert P. Lewis, author of Love Me When I'm Gone, received his degrees. So Glenn Ford, born May 1st, 1916, and he passed away in 2006. On August 30th. He was born Gwilyn Samuel Newton Ford in St. Christine, Quebec, and he was an actor, and he appeared in 106 films and several television series. For his military service, he has received the French Legion of Honor Medal in 1992 for his service in World War II. The Medal of Honor presented by the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the Médaille de la France Libre for the liberation of France, 2 commendation medals from the U.S. Navy, and was inducted into the Vietnamese Legion of Merit. More than half of his movie appearances were in westerns, but Ford played equally well in light comedies and film noir, and was voted the #1 male box office attraction in 1958. He was inducted into the National Cowboy Hall of Fame by Western Heritage Museum in 1978. Again, initiated at Palisades Lodge number 637, which is now Santa Monica Palisades number 307, and he's a charter member of Rivera Lodge number 780, Pacific Palisades, California. That's it for this week. Please remember to find us on Facebook and follow on Twitter at Whence Came You. Please check out the Midnight Freemasons 3 times a week, www.midnightfreemasons.org. We publish on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, new articles all the time. If you like what you see there, please check out the Working Tools magazine at twtmag.com. We do have a section in there, but we are surrounded by great authors in that magazine, great writers, and special thanks to Corey Sigler, who has given us a spot in that magazine every month. So thank you very much for that. Also, please check out the new show, The Masonic Roundtable, and you can find that at themasonicroundtable.com. Remember, you have to put themasonicroundtable.com. It's a YouTube channel as well as a full-blown website, and links to all of the episodes and more will be there. We're also on iTunes with that show as well, so please remember to rate this show on iTunes, Whence Came You, and also please rate the Masonic Roundtable on iTunes as well. Please remember that next week on the 11th of June, I will be at Kingsbury Lodge in Olyphant, Pennsylvania, so I hope to see you guys all there. And that's it. I'll talk to you all next week. Stay in the level. For Whence Came You, I'm Robert Johnson.